it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
This is Undead Live Morning Edition, reporting from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, and night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or still fully alive. Today is Sunday, October 18th. I'm Athena Aktipis.
And I'm Dave Lumberg-Kenrick, and today is the final day of the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting. We continue this morning with our interdisciplinary coverage of all matters zombie and apocalypse.
And now for our Apocalypse Today highlights. How do you feel about sex? For the majority of people alive and undead today, the answer comes with more than a few hang-ups and often a bit of embarrassment. But the feelings and stigmas around what is supposedly normal have ebbed, flowed, shifted, and evolved countless times throughout history and in different cultures around the world, not to mention during our current zombie apocalypse. This morning, we'll hear from the editor of Popular Science magazine, Rachel Feltman, about the weirdest things you didn't know about sex. We'll also be serving up a special 11:30 edition of Undead Live to explore the question of why some of us believe in the undead while others don't believe. But before we start, we're going to bring our apocalypse frontline correspondents in, Larry and Steve. Larry, Steve, are you there?
No, we haven't been able to get them connected again. We're not sure what the situation is on the ground, but we did receive another video.
So you haven't heard from them? I thought they were going to join us this morning.
Just another video with nothing, no explanation. So do you want to check it out?
Yeah, let's play the video.
Okay.
I just heard shots outside. There's something going on. I saw some zombies last night. And there was nothing. These fucking shots. Oh, fuck. I don't know what those guys are up to. Oh, man. Ow. Shit. I don't know what. I gotta be fucking quiet. I gotta be quiet up here. Oh, man. They're coming into the house. All right. This is it. I guess this is my last broadcast. I just want to say, we gotta learn to stick together. It didn't have to end this way. We could have fucking licked those zombies. Oh, shit.
Christmas came early, boys.
This is it. I'm signing off. I'm gonna send this. Oh.
Rooms up here, boys.
Larry, can you hear us? Are you there?
Larry, it was pre-recorded. It's not live. We don't even know if he sent it, if they sent it. We don't know how we. Yeah.
All right. Dave, can you take it from here?
Sure. So if you're joining our broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, please join our reporting team by commenting about any goings on in your city or neighborhood. Simply comment on the stream on whatever platform you're on. We'll be able to see your reports in real time and bring them into our broadcast. We're just going to move on with our first guest of the day, popular science editor Rachel Feltman, here to give us a rousing history of sex around the world and across cultures. Rachel, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Some harrowing stuff from your correspondence on the ground. I sure hope that everyone's safe.
We just got to move on.
Stressful. Yeah, but we got to keep the show going. You know, we're here to bring the news to everybody during the zombie apocalypse, and it's hard when our correspondents experience these kinds of situations, but you're a journalist. You gotta keep going on no matter what the situation.
True. That's why I'm still working on writing my book in the middle of a zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, so Rachel, tell us, what is your book that you're writing?
Yeah, so I am working on a book for Bold Type Press. The working title is Arousing History of Sex, or Sex Arousing History. And basically, we are looking at the cultural, biological, medical history of sex, across time through different cultures, and really what we're getting at, what I'm finding in my research is that our idea of what is normal when it comes to sex, the way we have it, the way we treat related medical issues, the way we talk about it, it changes so quickly and has changed so many times. So, there are these like core truths of how important sex is to humanity and, of course, all other living species. But a lot of what we take for granted as being normal, or the way sex is supposed to be, or what is natural, are pretty recent inventions, or even things that have been reinvented and uninvented time and time again. So I think especially in tumultuous times like these, it's really important that people realize how complex our cultural history and hangups are.
So what's an example of something that, used to be normal that isn't normal anymore, or is normal now that was not normal before?
Sure. Well, so one thing that I have always been really interested in as a journalist are sexually transmitted infections and their epidemiology and their history. And so a lot of my first research on the book was focused on STIs and the stigma around them. And what's really fascinating is that when you go back through history, certainly symptomatic STIs were not without stigma. In fact, at times they were stigmatized to a degree that we would now find ridiculous. But on the other hand, asymptomatic STIs, like the majority of cases of herpes in humans, for example, of course they weren't stigmatized because people didn't even know that they had an issue. So I think, talking about the history of STIs, I think can really open up our eyes to how much of our history of feelings about sex are so influenced by these very brief periods in culture. So one of my favorite stories is that the history of syphilis, we don't even know how old it is because it's very complicated when you look back at the early writing on STIs to tell what sexually transmitted infections they were talking about. There were so many euphemisms. There was probably a lot of confusing gonorrhea and chlamydia with syphilis and vice versa. But around the 15th century, there was really this boom in cases, and it was because Charles VIII of France sent his army into Italy, and he sent 50,000 troops, I believe, and that kicked off a rampant syphilis outbreak that spread through Europe and beyond. And syphilis was pretty much endemic for quite some time after that. It became really a fact of life. So you see this very extreme stigmatization. There are some stories about Charles VIII actually trying to banish large groups of people infected with syphilis out into the streets, which frankly sounds like the beginning of a zombie movie to me, if you know anything about neurosyphilis and how that disease progresses. But on the other
Rachel,
hand,
can you tell us about neurosyphilis briefly?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So syphilis is a really fascinating infection because it has several stages, and it goes dormant after your initial symptoms. So like any STI, syphilis does not have to be a big deal if you are open about having it and seek treatment. But unfortunately, before we had antibiotics, the second was never really that much of an option. Syphilis treatments were quite horrific, and at one point included malaria, which I can talk about a little bit later. But after you present with these kind of not too disturbing symptoms, you would often have like a painless sore, then you would seem to get better. And then you generally would have secondary syphilis later on, which would be, a reemergence of more severe symptoms. But if it's not treated, then sometimes decades later or just a few years later, you can end up with tertiary syphilis, where it is, attacking various organ systems. And neurosyphilis is an infamous possible result of that stage of syphilis. I believe Al Capone is widely believed to have suffered from neurosyphilis, but it is the syphilis microbe attacking your brain.
And does it cause zombie-like symptoms?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of zombie-like symptoms, but it certainly can cause cognitive decline, confusion, aggression, vague, really anything related to general dementia. According to some stories, Charles VIII and other rulers around that time would just banish large groups of people who they thought had syphilis. Now, given how poorly syphilis and other STIs were understood at the time, it's quite likely that many people who had syphilis really flew under the radar. It was probably, as is so often the case, people who were powerful, who had syphilis, their symptoms were explained away as being part of other medical issues or just ignored. And if you were poor, anything you had that resembled symptoms of syphilis could have you stigmatized for being sick. I just imagine in my head these like hordes of people, suffering from secondary or tertiary syphilis outside the city gates. And all of this could have been avoided with a better public health system. That's what I have to say.
Thanks, Rachel. You mentioned treating syphilis with malaria?
Yes, that is one of my favorite stories about the histories of sexually transmitted infection. So not only was it once considered totally reasonable to treat syphilis by giving a patient malaria, but someone actually won the Nobel Prize for doing this. This was in 1927, and a European scientist decided to. He was a psychiatrist, and he was working with patients specifically who had signs of neurosyphilis. And he was interested in this concept called pyrotherapy, which is where you essentially try to induce a fever to cook the infection out of someone. And he decided that the best way to do that was by giving patients malaria. As is so often the case in the history of medicine, he likely did not achieve informed consent from his patients before giving them malaria. And was it successful? Well, according to the Nobel Prize Committee, it was. But I think modern doctors are pretty skeptical that this was particularly effective. But yeah, until we had antibiotics to treat syphilis, the treatments were all very, very purgative. The idea was to get the infection out of you, and often the treatments were quite horrible. We're talking about, taking mercury, burning sores with pieces of hot iron, and of course, giving yourself other infections like malaria to try to induce a high enough fever to get rid of the disease.
It's fascinating, Rachel, and it really kind of dovetails with one of the other topics that we've been discussing, which is this desire people often have to just eradicate completely whatever they perceive as the threat, whether it's a STI or it's cancer or it's, a zombie horde, that sort of instinct to let's just get rid of it all. But sometimes that process of being sort of aggressive and in this eradication mindset can have other consequences, whether it's, the cure being worse than the ailment, or, we were talking yesterday about sort of the evolution of resistance and how this, mindset of eradication can actually change the evolution of the diseases. So lots of interesting connections there. I want to pivot though to ask you a little bit about some of your favorite characters from your story. In particular, I want to hear more about Nikola Tesla. I'm just intrigued by the little snippets that I've heard about Tesla.
Yeah, it's really funny because Nikola Tesla is a much lauded figure by certain sects of nerddom these days, I would say. And Nikola Tesla was definitely a brilliant man, but socially and sexually, he had a lot of issues that I think today would have really placed him under a lot of public scrutiny if he had a Twitter, I would say. So for one thing, Nikola Tesla was... he strongly believed that his virginity, his very widespread. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I was distracted by a comment. Yes, it's true. I should have mentioned that in addition to really being unscrupulous about how he tested giving malaria to people who had syphilis, Wagner was also almost certainly a Nazi. So as is so often the case in the history of medicine, not a good dude, didn't do particularly good science, won a Nobel Prize for it anyway. Thank you for mentioning that, Joe. So, but yeah, in Nikola Tesla, back to him, another man who was maybe not particularly such a great dude, he spoke quite often very derisively about women and about sex in general. And he strongly believed that his choice to not have sex, at least with women, probably with anyone, was responsible for his genius. He subscribed to the idea that keeping all of your manly elements within you was the best way to be strong and smart. For what it's worth, there's actually absolutely no medical basis to this. Obviously, everyone should have exactly as much sex and masturbate exactly as much as makes them physically happy, which may be not at all, but you are in no way preserving your vitality, manhood, womanhood, or other genderhood by abstaining from sex. So throughout history, there were definitely some people who looked at Nikola Tesla's proud virginity as a sign that he was secretly gay, but at least based on the research I've done, there's no particular evidence of this either. He seems to have really subscribed to this philosophy of being celibate by choice and speaking in very derogatory terms about people who chose to get married and have sex. But he also had a very intense attachment to his pigeons. He kept pigeons. And And this often got him into trouble, actually, in places that he stayed. He kind of seems to have been a little bit of a hoarder in terms of bird keeping. But there was one pigeon in particular who he said he loved as a man loves a woman. Now, of course, Nikola Tesla made it very clear that he had never had any of those kinds of feelings for a human. So we have to take that comparison with a grain of salt. But certainly he said that this bird was heavenly, a creature of ethereal beauty. She was his muse, and he loved her more than he could ever love a person. And he spoke very poetically about this bird, and seems to have been quite heartbroken when she died. So yeah, he had a lot going on. And every time a movie comes out about Nikola Tesla and they don't address his intense attachment to this bird, I'm very upset.
Rachel, Diana Fleischman has a comment here. She says that there are lots of cultures that talk about this idea of preserving sexual energy. And she's wondering, if there's something to it, or, what are your thoughts on that? Why is it a notion that is pervasive that, not having intercourse and masturbating somehow preserves your sexual energy?
Yeah, it is an idea that comes up again and again. You see, this whole anti-masturbation movement that featured, figures like Kellogg, who famously made his bland cereals. A lot of people say that he made breakfast cereals bland so that you wouldn't be excited by spicy breakfast food. But I actually read some research that he was worried that if your bowels were full, that they might excite you. I guess he was suggesting that a full bowel might stimulate your prostate. I don't really know what he was getting at, but apparently his whole thing was that if you were having regular poops, you wouldn't accidentally get turned on. And that's why we have breakfast cereal. But it's true that this idea does pop up periodically, but I would say that just as often we have cultural movements throughout the world and throughout history that focus on the idea that having lots of sex or particular kinds of sex contributes to your vitality. So I think it's less about there being something there and more about just kind of the human condition and the constant quest for finding out what the secret to being better and stronger is. And I think there's also often quite a lot of misogyny built into that idea that there's some kind of sexual energy that's lost if you have sex. In the same way there's a lot of misogyny built into the idea that there's some kind of purity value that's lost if a woman has sex. Yeah, it's true. There are many cultures that focus on preserving sexual energy. And it is, totally possible that some of those practices, have some kind of basis in reality. But when you look throughout history, most of them don't.
Rachel, I'm going to jump in because we have a bunch of evolutionary biologists sort of with us here on the stream. Carlo Mealy is pointing out that if you look at lizards, for example, that suppressing reproduction, so taking out the reproductive organs can extend lifespan. Now, of course, that's different from not engaging in sex if you have those reproductive organs, but it's interesting that there is some evidence, at least in other species, that being less sexual sometimes can extend lifespan. So I don't know, maybe more work is needed.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, hormones are wild, but we're also not anoles, is the argument I would make. So.
That is fair. So, Rachel, how did you come to study this topic?
Yeah, well, as a science journalist, I've always been really fascinated with sexual health and medicine. I think it's a topic that really needs better communication and education. I was raised by a female OBGYN, so a lot of information about sex I just kind of absorbed by osmosis. But the formal sex education I got was pretty bad. And so, yeah, coming into, the world of science journalism, where I'm really motivated by just learning as many things as possible and trying to digest and share as much information as possible in a way that's helpful to the general public. Sex is one of the topics where that's most important, and where it's gotten the least attention. So yeah,
what was the landscape of sex education like when you were growing up?
Well, so for me, I was growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s in rural South Jersey. So it was mostly non-existent. But, I remember in my 9th grade health class, there were people who were learning for the first time that HIV was sexually transmitted. There were also lots of people who thought that there was secretly a cure for HIV that Magic Johnson had purchased. There's just a lot of misinformation. We watched we watched kind of like a Lifetime style movie that was meant to change our stigmatized views on HIV, but it had been made in like 1991. So yeah, I really didn't learn much about how STIs actually work and the kinds of prevention efforts that actually make a difference until I was a science journalist writing about STI rates across the US.
Yeah. And so now you're writing this book, and who's your audience for this rousing history?
Yeah, I mean, it's a book for anybody who loves talking about weird history facts. I have a podcast called The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week, where we just share kind of bizarre stories from the world of science, health, and tech. And so the book is definitely for the same people who are those kind of, you like being a weird person at parties with weird facts to share. But it's also for people who kind of don't know what questions to ask when it comes to sex. Maybe teenagers who are embarrassed to talk about sex or ask about sex, or for adults who realize that they, didn't have a great sex ed experience, but kind of don't know where to start in terms of filling up the gaps in their knowledge.
Makes sense. Rachel, I want to ask you also just about fetishes and taboos across history. So what are some of your favorite examples of like changes that have happened in sort of what people have been interested in sexually and what they've considered taboo across time and place?
Yeah, I mean, so a huge example, though obviously it's not a fetish, is the taboo nature of same-sex attraction. Being attracted to multiple genders. And, when you look back throughout history, there are so many periods where this was okay, where it was encouraged, or where there just wasn't a name for it. And it was very easy for things to happen without people knowing. And then it's actually like a very recent cultural shift for us to have this concept of, people being gay or straight. And so that's something that I'm, really just diving into the research on now, but finding really fascinating. In terms of fetishes, back when the DSM was like first talking about paraphilias, this concept of an unusual sexual preference. There were like things as benign as like enjoying making dirty phone calls were in there right along with, say, pedophilia. And so I think it's looking at those kind of like 60s and 70s sexual health discussions is very eye-opening in terms of how what a strange time it was. Truly, a lot of the 20th century discussion of sex that for many of us is internalized as normal was actually just like a really bizarre time in the medical community in terms of the way they felt about sex and the way they talked about it.
So, Rachel, I'm curious about your thoughts on, how flexible do you think human sexuality is, given what you have learned from your research on this book? Are there things that don't change? If so, what are they? And are there things that are really flexible? And if so, what are they?
I think the thing that doesn't change is that sex is hugely important to our culture. Of course it is, from a biological standpoint, it's arguably the most important thing there is for a species, particularly for ours. We aren't designed to have huge broods of children, but that kind of just like makes the focus on those mating and relationship dynamics all the more crucial. On the other hand, one thing that is always the same is that there will always be people who are more interested in sex than other people. There will always be people who are doing things that freak the people around them out. But everything else really changes. It's very fluid. And I think, looking back at the history of sex, you see how much influence the cultural norms around you have on what you grow up doing and wanting to do. So I think from that standpoint, it seems incredibly fluid to me.
We're having a lot of chatter in the comments about asexuality. So here, Liz is asking, would Tesla today identify as asexual or on the ace spectrum? What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I try not to do armchair diagnoses, but I have to say for Tesla, I certainly hope that today with the resources to find a community and to name what he was feeling and better understand it. I do suspect he would be on the ace spectrum, and I hope that he would have been a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Level-headed individual for it. Instead, when you look at his writings, it's very similar to what you see in kind of like incel communities on Reddit or that kind of thing. So while we have no way of knowing, I think kind of the most favorable way to look at the kinds of things that Tesla was saying was that he was somewhere on the ace spectrum and didn't have the support for that.
What is the ace spectrum?
So asexual.
Wait, I see. So it's just like, okay, gotcha. Because we had this question of, so it's ranging from sort of just not very sexual to asexual. Is that essentially what the ace spectrum means?
Well, so it's not a term that I use frequently. I was responding to its use in the question, but you can be asexual but still have romantic attachments, or you can be asexual and aromantic. So there's there is a spectrum beyond just being asexual or not being asexual.
Oh, okay. I just wasn't sure what that term meant. So gotcha.
Rachel, how common is this asexuality or something like it historically?
So I don't have data on that, but there's actually a great book that just came out on the history of asexuality. I believe ACE is in the title, and it just came out within a couple months ago, so folks should be able to find it. But that's something that, historically there really hasn't been that much research on, and I think it's just now starting to get attention. So I think figuring out how common asexuality is in the human population and how much cultural influence there is over its expression, I think is something that will be really interesting to find out in the coming years.
Yeah. And what would you say are the most important things that we need to be thinking about in terms of sex education, not just for young people, but just more broadly for the population? What are some of the sort of holes in public knowledge that you think are the most critical that we should be filling?
Yeah, I think so much of what it comes down to is stigma, and all of the research that I've read on the subject shows very convincingly that the less stigma there is around sex, sexually transmitted infections, unsafe sex, the more likely people are to be safe and to get tested and to seek out help if they need it. And so the more we allow these taboos and these stigmas to drive the conversation, the more danger we're actually putting our sexually active population in. And I think too, it's also really important to realize the connection between healthcare access and sexual wellness. You know, it's easy to see rates of rising STIs in the US and blame Tinder. But in fact, the demographics where we see rates rising are generally more marginalized groups that either face more stigma and or have less access to healthcare. So, you know, the answer is really clear. If we want to have fewer STIs circulating, we need to be kinder to people, be more open, and make healthcare easy to get. And yeah, I would say that's the biggest takeaway.
Thanks, Rachel. I think this gives us lots of food for thought. And this is, I think, a great transition for us also into our next talk. You know, we've heard about all of these things that vary from you, Rachel. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm going to put you backstage in the studio. We'd love to have you part of the conversation as we continue. But now we're going to bring on Courtney Crosby. Courtney has some data about something that is quite universal about sex preferences. And that is regarding the undead and sex with dead people. So, Courtney, today you're going to be talking with us about sexual disgust towards the recently deceased. Courtney, it's a pleasure to have you here on the show with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've really enjoyed this weekend, although it's a little spooky. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about sex differences in sexual disgust towards sex with dead bodies. So pretty relevant for the zombie apocalypse. And sexual disgust is this emotion that is hypothesized to aid in mate selection by deterring individuals from engaging in costly sexual situations or behaviors, but also from picking maybe a costly mate or sexual partner. And previous work shows that women on average are more sexually disgusted than men. And this is a large and robust finding. It's not just one study, it's been replicated a bunch. And this is especially true for things like incest, having sex with someone who has poor hygiene, as well as promiscuous sex or group sex. And if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense because there are these cost discrepancies with parental investment where women need to secure kind of a long-term mate that will invest in her and her offspring. And also women face and bear a brunt of the costs in terms of things like STI, contraction. So because of the climate of the vagina, women are not only more susceptible to STIs, but they incur greater risk when having them, but they also face things like pregnancy risk, etc. And one thing that I've been really interested in is, okay, so are there sexual behaviors where maybe this cost discrepancy between men and women is smaller? And if so, is there a lack of sex difference in sexual disgust? And so what I wanted to look at is the idea of sex with a dead person, or a zombie, if you will. And this is really costly for men and women alike, right? So, you know, maybe there is bacterial transmission bacterial transmission that they face the risk of, but also things like reputational damage. And so is there a difference, or are the sexes more similar in this? So to look at this, we had participants from 9 different cultures fill out a battery of questionnaires, including the sexual disgust inventory. And this measure specifically asks individuals to provide judgments for 31 different sexual acts about how disgusting they consider them. So ranging from not at all sexually disgusting to extremely sexually disgusting. And one of those behaviors is sex with a dead person. And this is an example of kind of what that measure looks like, but we're looking at sex with a dead person here. And then we conducted some analyses just to look at variation in sexual disgust at the individual and also the cultural level. And this is where our data is coming from. So we have 9 different people, or regions rather, that participated in this study. And you can see kind of the ratio of women to men. And it's pretty evenly split in each of these places, except for Russia. We do have a lot more women who participated in this. And collaborators, I'm not really going to talk about this, but I'm happy to elaborate, translated all of the materials, and we went through this process. But then they helped collect data for these participants. And so what did we find? So this is a kind of confusing graphic, so I'm just going to kind of walk you through it. But basically, this is looking at the judgments of sexual disgust across all of the items on that inventory. And this just shows that, so men's average rating of disgust towards those items in the US, for example, really is highly correlated to women in the US, how they view all of those behaviors, as well as women and men in all of the different geographic regions. So this is saying that kind of regardless of where an individual is, or if they're male or female, they're viewing these items pretty consistently around the world. And zombie or not, I'm not sure. And then necrophilia specifically, also another graphic that I'll just orient you to. So this is the rating of sexual disgust. So again, not at all disgusted to extremely. And women and men around the world are pretty consistently kind of indicating that that is an extremely sexually disgusting thing. We're getting ceiling effects, but you can see some interesting variation here where the distributions look a little different, but again, they're all centered around the most sexually disgusting that can be. But if you look at the kind of figure here on the bottom right, this is looking at the kind of effect size in all of the different regions, where if it is on the right of this line, men are more sexually disgusted and vice versa. So women and men, according to these different regions, there is some variation. So places like Kenya, for example, women are saying that this is more sexually disgusting than men. But again, kind of consistently, everyone is saying this is really sexually disgusting. I don't think maybe we should participate in this. And I love this GIF, by the way. It's really funny, I think. So to conclude, regardless of an individual's sex or location, necrophilia does not appear to be particularly appetizing. And I want to say that this is pretty rare. So when it does happen, I'm curious if maybe men do this more than women. And I would be really interested if there's like behavioral data that speaks to this. But I do want to point out also that it is not an adaptation. So we don't have this adaptation to have sex with dead people. So when it does happen, or situations that maybe are in parallel of this, is maybe men participating or having sex with someone who's like inebriated, for example. So again, pretty rare. I think if it does happen, maybe there are some psychopathy at play, or individual differences in that. And there's this interesting cultural variation that we found, despite it being consistently disgusting. But I also want to point out that we collected this data prior to the zombie apocalypse. So I'm really interested. I wonder if that has shifted at all now that we're all basically dead and walking around. Are we having sex or not? And I would be interested to study that, but I don't have any data to speak to that. And that is all I have.
Courtney, thank you so much. I have a question I want to jump right in with. So you mentioned that for those individuals who do have sex with or desire sex with dead people or zombies, that's not an adaptation. When it does happen, why? What do you think the reason is? Is it a byproduct of another adaptation, or is it just like noise in the system, or is it maybe coming from being part of a culture, maybe a zombie culture, where that's something acceptable to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when this is happening, that it's likely parasitizing men's evolved tendency or desire for sexual variety. So men on average desire more partners, and short-term sex is really in their reproductive success in terms of their own interest in that. And so I think that when it does happen, it's likely that these situations present themselves and men have this tendency to want to have sex more often than not. And I think that there are probably things like psychopathy at play here, and just maybe the amount of partners that are in that area.
Interesting. So you think that maybe it's really just something that is a result of kind of unusual circumstances?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think that this happens often, which may explain why people are saying that this is so sexually disgusting. But it does happen. And it's interesting to think about, why does this happen? And yeah. Sure.
So I have a question about this. Is it like, because I'm trying to think, is it like we have a desire to like have sex with anything, and then we have another thing that's like, don't have sex with that person because they're dead or whatever? Or is it like, so is necrophilia, is it like a desire to have sex with dead people, or is it a lack of a mechanism that says, hold on, don't, you know what I mean?
Totally. So I think that men have this evolved desire for sexual variety for things that will increase their reproductive success, right? So on average, this tends to be a woman who is maybe fertile and in this kind of beautiful window of, I guess, age-wise, right? And I think that can just be parasitized based on what situation you're in. So maybe you're in a situation, there's a person, they're dead, do you have sex with them? But I think that this emotion should become activated in these contexts to help people avoid these situations, because this is pretty costly. It can maybe lead to decrements in social status, for example, or reputational damage. And so I think that we both have this evolved tendency for these behaviors, but that disgust should be activated to stop engaging in costly situations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to bring Rachel in, actually, and we have some interesting comments happening that I was hoping we could all chat about together.
Sure.
So, Rachel, tell us, what is the sort of cultural history of necrophilia? Can you give us your perspective, having done research in this area?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to say, unfortunately, that necrophilia is not a taboo that I have focused research on yet. I have mostly been looking at the more common fetishes and paraphilias, but it does, it is one of those things that references pop up for it everywhere. It is certainly not a new invention.
Yeah. So, Courtney, please.
Oh, so I was just going to say that if you think about why maybe we see this so commonly and there are laws about this, and I think that it's really interesting because laws don't just kind of pop up for no reason, right? Like, we create laws to regulate the behavior of others based on what behaviors people are engaging in. And so I do think that this does happen, and perhaps that's why we see this so prevalently, like when you're reading about sexual taboos. But I do think it's rare. But it's also this kind of sticky thing, right? So if you think about sex with a dead person, you're going to remember someone like talking about that versus someone just saying, I have a foot obsession that I like to have feet in my sexual experiences. I do think that is more sticky.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we have a whole lot of chatter kind of going on about cases of necrophilia. Diana is mentioning this famous case of attempted necrophilia, where a teenage boy saw a beautiful girl had been killed and then tried to break into her casket. But he and his friends were caught before they got in. So I think, it's something that, when we do hear stories about it, it is intriguing, maybe because it is so unusual.
So one historical thing that particular anecdote does make me think of is the history of the sexualization and fetishization of women dying. There was a period where there was actually a fashion movement widely known today as consumptive chic, and indeed in kind of the particularly in like the late 1800s, there was a lot of beauty norms focused around women looking like they had tuberculosis, because there were, these wealthy young women who would become fragile and flush, and it was considered a disease of the passions, that you were being overwhelmed by your emotions and becoming weaker and weaker. And with that, when we see that kind of fetishization of women who are nearly dead, there has been a lot of historical writing and research on the idea that it is about the idea of control over a very, very weakened woman. So, in that particular instance where you're talking about, not necessarily where it's someone actually seeking out a corpse because they think it's so beautiful, that I think that idea of the fetishization of this powerless woman that can be gotten like an object is much more common than true necrophilia. So I think that's really interesting.
That's interesting. It does also dovetail with the conversation that we had on Friday about sex robots, right? And the idea of being able to possess somebody who you can have sex with, and you don't actually have to kind of deal with the issues of consent like you would with somebody who was fully alive. Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
Was, delightful conversation about a really disturbing topic. So wonderful to have you both to chat with us about that. So now that we have talked about cultural differences around sex, and we talked a little bit about cultural universals, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of using culture as a defense for doing things that might not be acceptable in certain circles. So next up, we have anthropologist Lee Cronk here with us to share when you can and when you can't get away with saying, my culture made me do it. Yep. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah. So I labeled my talk, my culture made me do it. I guess first thing I should do is clarify what I mean by culture, because in popular talk, it means high culture, arts, literature, things like that. And of course, those things are culture, but within the context of anthropology and animal behavior studies, it just means socially transmitted information. So anything ranging from a symphony on down to what to put in your go bag or how to cook up a batch of brains, all that stuff is culture. It's socially transmitted information, whether it's deliberately transmitted or just transmitted by, say, watching somebody do something, cook something, say. You learn that way.
So Lee, culture is a sexually transmitted information. So, I mean, it could even be viral. Socially. Did I say sexually transmitted information? Wow, this is really getting in the brain.
We're not talking about sex, I think, today. But,
so socially transmitted information, which could also be damaging sometimes, or does it have to be helpful?
Absolutely. Doesn't have to be helpful. That's the problem with culture, is that there's different ways for culture traits to be transmitted. So if they're being transmitted vertically from parents to offspring down up and down the generations, then they're likely to be adaptive and helpful to the individual, because the selection pressures on them are similar to the selection pressures on genes, so that you have more brains to get your culture traits into if you have more kids. But if culture traits are being transmitted horizontally, peer-to-peer, then the selection pressures on them are more similar to what selection pressures on, say, viruses are. So they are sometimes referred to as mind viruses. And the things that they can make people do aren't necessarily going to be adaptive. And so one way to think about this defense, the formal name for the my culture made me do it defense, is the cultural defense. There's a whole literature on the cultural defense if anybody wants to look it up, would be to say, okay, well, if someone were diseased, literally with a virus, say, that was making them behave in a way that was illegal, we would, I think the legal system would say, well, their behavior is not their own behavior. Their behavior is that of the disease. They're zombified by the disease. So if culture trait is infecting somebody in a sense and making them do something that is illegal, do we hold them accountable for that? Or do we get them off the hook because their culture made them do it? That's the cultural defense question.
So, Lee, can you give an example of
Sure.
something that would be a culture defense or something historical that's happened along these lines?
Yeah, I've got a couple of examples from the before times. One was a famous one that's in the literature. It comes from California. It was a Japanese woman, I think it was in the 80s, living in the Santa Monica area. Hadn't been living there very long. Had a couple of kids and a husband, a Japanese husband. Found out that her husband had been having an affair, and in her humiliation and shame, decided that she would commit what my sources tell me is, in Japanese, I don't speak Japanese, by the way, is a yakushinju, which is a sort of ritual parent-child suicide homicide. And she attempted to kill herself and her children by going into the Pacific Ocean at Santa Monica Beach. She succeeded in killing her kids, but not in killing herself. So she was prosecuted. And part of her defense was the cultural defense, the idea that in Japan, this would have been an acceptable thing to do because if in certain circumstances, if shame and humiliation are extreme enough, then suicide and even suicide combined with murder are acceptable. This is what she claimed. And she was backed up on this by members of her community, the Japanese immigrant community in California. And the court partially agreed with her on this. They gave her a sentence of 1 year in prison and 5 years of probation. So it worked pretty well as a defense. There was another one. So one of the things that you may notice about that is this is an immigrant. So very often the cultural defense is something that happens in court cases where somebody is an immigrant. So they're bringing with them a set of cultural values and ideas from one place and applying them in another context where they lead to illegal behavior. So another case of this, kind of perhaps even more disturbing case, was in Brooklyn in 1989. A Chinese immigrant, man, found out that his wife was not sexually faithful to him, and in his horror and feeling his honor had been shamed and so on, he killed her with a claw hammer. And he used the cultural defense, backed up by testimony from an anthropologist who had worked in China, who claimed that in the context of China, this would have been acceptable behavior because he was so shamed. And it worked. He got time served plus 5 years probation. So there are quite a few cases. There's, like I said, a large literature on that. So
now, Lee, you said
yeah,
that
sure.
you're not talking about sex, but actually both of those examples hinged on
Yes.
sexual infidelity. So
Yes.
how common is it that the cultural defense gets used in sort of responses to sexual infidelity that are sort of coming from a cultural background that leads to sort of different norms about that?
Yeah. I don't have any data on exactly how common it is. My reading of the literature is that that's a very common thing. There's also other sorts of things that people use the cultural defense for like honor killings, which of course ultimately has to do with sex. FGM, female genital mutilation or modification, also I think ultimately having a connection to sex and sexuality. So there is a sex or sexuality connection to many of these cases, I would say, yes. That's true with human life in general, right? Where sex and sexuality have a role to play in many, many facets of our existence.
Yeah, Lisa, how legitimate is this culture defense from your perspective as an anthropologist who studies socially transmitted information?
Good question. And it's a hard one to answer because we just don't know enough about the relationship between culture and behavior. So the cultural defense rests on a couple of things if you're going to use it. One is that you have to make a case that you understand how the particular culture traits would have shaped behavior back home, say, because again, it's mostly immigrant cases. In the case of the guy who killed his wife with a claw hammer in Brooklyn, there really wasn't there. And the anthropologist who testified in his defense admitted that he had never heard of any such case in China. So the support for that defense in that case didn't seem to be strong. So it's a very sort of notorious and controversial case as a result of that. The other thing is more broad, is that it rests on the idea that we have interesting comment from Charles, from Barbara, that we have a good understanding of how culture shapes behavior. That we understand something about why, after all, the world is full of culture traits, lots and lots of information flying around that we either pick up on and use to shape our behavior or don't. Think of advertising. Advertising is all about shaping our behavior, but most of us just washes over us and we ignore it, to the chagrin of advertisers. But why do sometimes culture traits shape behavior and sometimes not? Is there something about the culture trait, something about the context? We know very little about that. There has been, I think one of the major reasons why we don't know much about it is because, that's a good question. Could a Nazi use this defense for participating in concentration camp killings? The culture made him do it. He could try. I don't think at Nuremberg it would have worked very well, but he could try. A more recent case, who was the, I should have had this ready in my notes, the Harvey Weinstein. He when he was accused of all kinds of nefarious sexual predator behavior, he said, well, it was the culture. When I grew up, it was the culture. Of course, there were many, many other American men who grew up at the same time that Harvey Weinstein did and don't do what Harvey Weinstein did. So I think that's a fairly weak defense in his case. But yeah, people can try it in all kinds of circumstances. So why don't we have a better understanding of culture and its impact on behavior? One of the reasons is cultural anthropology. And so this actually brings me back to something that Catherine Townsend said in the Undead live session on Friday about Colin Turnbull and his depiction of the Ik in Uganda. So those of you who saw that session may remember that the Ik are people in Uganda. Turnbull was there in the 60s, depicted them as the most selfish, mean, awful, loveless people on earth in a very famous book called The Mountain People, famous among anthropologists anyway, called The Mountain People. And Catherine subsequently went there and did research and found that no, they're not the loveless people, they're not selfish and mean. What Turnbull failed to take into account was that they were starving. And what he was seeing was the reaction to starvation and famine. So why did he not take that seriously? Because as a cultural anthropologist at that time, and even today, he had a one-word theory of behavior, culture. If people are doing something, it's their culture making them do it. So there's a sort of stance taken in cultural anthropology that that's the only explanation of behavior we're done. Whereas other scholars like me and many other people see culture as one of the things that shapes behavior, but not the only thing. So there's many other things that can shape behavior too, including famine. And so that opens the door to saying, having a systematic science of when culture has an impact on behavior and when it does not. There has not been a lot of research on this, but there has been some speculation on it. In fact, somebody Athena, wrote an interesting piece on this back 10, 15 years ago, Rob Kurzban, arguing that we should have a sort of immune system for culture traits, because some culture traits will be adaptive and helpful and some won't be. So how do we tell them apart? We should be gullible towards the ones that will be helpful and skeptical and resistant to the ones that will be damaging.
This ties in with the zombification issue, right? Like
Absolutely.
If a culture, the socially transmitted information can kind of hijack your brain to make you do things that might not be in your best interests.
Yes.
You should have some defenses against that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do. So he suggested, so what should we be gullible for? Technology was Kurzban's suggestion. So if a bit of technology is working, if StreamYard is working, which it's working really well, use it, go for it. Don't question it. Another suggestion he made was linguistic conventions. So when language can be used for many, many things, including some nefarious purposes, obviously. But we think that originally it's sort of adaptive benefit for our ancestors was social coordination. It allows us to coordinate our behaviors much more effectively than we could without language.
So Lee, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to kind of bring this all together here. So essentially you're saying that if we're going to actually have an understanding of the way that culture can or can't compel us to do things, we need better research on the impact of culture in general. And so that funding is needed. More funding is needed, and cultural anthropology kind of needs to integrate these other ecological aspects and these other aspects of context and biology and evolution in order for us to really be able to get a handle on this. And
culture is, well, anybody who studies behavior, there's culture anthropologists aren't the only people who study behavior or cultures. Any behavioral scientist needs to entertain the possibility that other things, culture, and many other things influence behavior, and focus some of their attention on why is it that culture traits work in some circumstances and not in others.
Thank you, Lee. That
Sure.
was really fascinating. Now it's time for us to bring back one of our featured brains, Barbara Natterson Horowitz, to talk to us about sexual consent and coercion among zombies and other nonverbal creatures. Barb, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, this is really exciting. I'm loving the chat, and every one of the speakers I'm literally on the edge of my chair. So thank you. I'm learning so much. And I'm going to quickly show some slides very, very fast, just to kind of spark a little conversation. And here we go.
I'm not seeing them come up
it's
yet.
not.
Are you
I
sharing
have
the
it.
screen?
Oh boy. Okay, 1 second. Let me try again. There we go.
Here we go.
No, yeah, here we go. Are
Yeah,
you
there
seeing? Alrighty. So we all love looking at courtship, right? These are some hooded grebes. These are, I have so many favorites, but these are among the best. I love the albatross. I mean, this is the Lazen albatross, and there's so much fascinating stuff about their courtships. These are coordinated, the beak fencing, and any albatross, I'll watch their courtship. Yep.
Barb, I think we have your wrong slides.
Oh, no.
Yeah, maybe you could
Okay.
just chat us about it.
Okay, I will. But can I try one more time? Let me just try quickly, and I will give up if it's not possible. But I think I can make it happen by, are you seeing albatross now?
You need to push play. Yeah. There we go. Okay.
All right. Okay. So I'll basically just wanted to say that we all love looking. Are you seeing hooded grebes?
Yes, here we go.
Love these hooded grebes. Courtship. More courtship. These are the albatross, right? Love this. Any albatross, the beak fencing, all of this courtship is just fantastic. Most people love bird of paradise, right? And you can watch it on and on and on. I even like courtship of the salamander, this tail chasing. Even fruit flies have really interesting courtship to watch and kind of break down. So, but the problem is most people talk about courtship, they talk about it as a ritual, or it's often spoken of as a ritual or a dance. And I reject that. I would say we shouldn't talk about courtship as a ritual. We shouldn't talk about it as a dance, because dances and rituals have a series of actions that are performed according to a prescribed order. And courtship is, there's a predetermined outcome with dances and rituals, but courtship is a conversation. It's a sexual communication. Should we or shouldn't we? Is it going to happen or not? There is no predetermined outcome, and missing that is a big blind spot. And so just really quickly, I really love watching turtle courtship. This is actually a red-eared slider courtship with the facial flickering and fluttering. And I just want to quickly show you this one study that I really love. It was done by a group of Brazilian biologists, and they looked at the red-headed Amazon river turtle. And it's interesting because you see that the female basically is being approached by the male, and she rejects about 86% of the advances. But among the ones who were rejected, only 4% come back. That means that 96% of the males who were told, they understand some part of that, or they are responding to, or I don't want to use, there is some sexual communication that is happening there, but it does not seem to be happening in this 4%. But what's interesting to me is that there's so much attention that has been paid to sexual coercion across the animal species, and I've written about it and studied it, and certainly there's lots that we can learn by looking at the various forms of sexual coercion, but it is in the vast majority of species, both invertebrates and vertebrates, in which sexual coercion has been identified and codified. Not all individuals coerce all the time. And so the question I think that I wanted to raise today is, what is going on with sexual communication? And is there a neurobiology of no? In other words, what is the difference between the individual who is coercing and the individual who appears to be understanding, and if you'll forgive the personification, respecting the signal of no? And I bring that up because I think there's a lot that animal sexuality and animal courtship can offer us in terms of understanding human sexuality and power dynamics. So really briefly, when we talk about the Weinstein case, that we were just talking about it. So some of the work that, originally Tim Clutton-Brock did in looking at sexual coercion, and particularly the intimidation coercion in animal societies, where if you look at the sex itself, it does not appear to be coercive the way some animal coercion is literally impossible to ignore, where an animal is physically restraining another animal. In the intimidation form of sexual coercion, it doesn't look coercive. And yet, when investigators have gone back and looked at the power dynamics within, let's say, the troop of chimpanzees, and this has been done, or even in other great apes, it turns out that the males that are the females who appear to be offering themselves to males have in fact been threatened, and there's a power gradient that is impacting the activity. And so this really allows us to see universally, you cannot assess coercive versus non-coercive sex unless you know what's going on in terms of the power between the individuals involved. And while this may seem like a sort of obvious point on the human side, I think recognizing this as a universal characteristic of coercion versus non-coercion is very powerful and opens up a new pathway to thinking about sexual communication. So with that, I'm going to just stop, and hopefully I've provoked.
That was awesome, Barb. So I would love to bring Rachel back in. Rachel, do you want to join us for this part of the discussion?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Well, first off, Barb, really, a shift of perspective, because, in evolutionary biology, there's kind of been this long history almost of thinking about, well, there are these examples from the animal world of coercive sex, right? And that's kind of been the focus. But you've shifted in terms of, looking at, well, what's actually going on in terms of consent. So I think that this is an extraordinarily important area for work.
Yeah, there's two things that I became really about 10 years ago when I really did not know about the pretty long and, as you say, pretty extensive literature on sexual coercion in animal societies. One of the things that was first interesting to me was the fact that the story was about, it happens, right? So to me, the first question was, well, who are the targeted animals? I mean, that was like an instinctive reaction. And so the first part of our work was to really look at what makes an animal vulnerable. And a lot of that has to do with age, actually, and of course, status and rank. And there's interesting work that really shows parallels between young individual, for example, ring-tailed lemur, who go into puberty earlier and haven't acquired dominant behavior of the females, who are at risk, versus young human females who have early puberty, who are at significantly elevated risk of being targeted for sexual molestation. So there are those parallels. But the flip side of it is, just because sexual coercive acts are identified in a species does not necessarily mean that is what happens, that every individual all of the time is coercive. So that was sort of the second part of it. And as you begin kind of letting that sort of seep in, you realize that yet another one of the blindfolds of human exceptionalism has been the de-individualization of animals, right? We look at a group of, whether it's penguins or ducks or whatever, and we have to remind ourselves that each one is an individual, with varying in all kinds of ways, but males, sexually mature males, are still at developmentally different stages. Their experiences are different, all of these kinds of things. So I think it's interesting to sort of pull back and say, let's stop looking at the fact of coercion, right? Coercion, and let's look at sort of what is happening when males, and usually it is males, in this particular case, but what happens when males get a signal of disinterest and back off, as these Amazon River turtles did in that one receptivity study?
Thanks, Barb. So, Rachel, if we kind of look at this now from the sort of cultural history perspective and, courtships and sort of these norms about like how sexual consent gets established, is that something that there has been a lot of cultural variation in? Have things changed a lot in terms of, courtship and consent historically?
Absolutely. I would say that, one of the most difficult topics for me to wrangle for my book is going to be the historical and cultural differences between courtships in courtships around the world and through time, because there are so many different strategies for people mating, for people to Barbara's point about power dynamics. Power dynamics between the sexes have been different in different places at different times. And you do see that having a huge impact on the way people have sex, the way people view virginity or sexual activity or sexual taboos. I think it is hugely important to kind of reframe our idea of what the natural world presents to us as being normal in terms of sexual power dynamics.
Yeah, do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the pieces of this that are, it's deciding that two individuals, when we look at animals, it's again hard sometimes to see them as individuals, and yet there's a lot of evidence for partner preference, not just in primates, but non-primate mammals, birds, and even in fish. There's really some fascinating studies of partner preference and now I'm going to blank on the name. So this idea that just because two individuals are both fertile and of the same species, that there will be sexual interest in by both is not the case, and that the not considering the social dynamics, power or otherwise, within these groups is a huge omission. The people who know this better than any other scientists, of course, are the fertility experts who work in zoos, where they know that they have to create diversity. So they have these, species where there are these genetic bottlenecks, and they're trying to, pair, individual A and individual B, and they get them exactly the right moment, and there is an interest. So the cultural piece of this within animal cultures and societies is very powerful. And I think that when we fail to see it in animals, it sets us up to also fail to see it in the human animal.
So I have a question. In modern human society, we have lots of sort of cultural and legal enforcement mechanisms for essentially people who rape go to jail, right? And so are there in animal species, are there sort of are there enforcement mechanisms to sort of enforce this idea of consent?
Right. So that's a really interesting question, and a couple of answers. So Tim Cletton-Brock, in his paper "Sexual Coercion in Animal Societies," addresses a little bit the issue of punishment, and of course, he's also written on punishment in animal societies. But it's not completely clear how that works. What we do know is he references a couple of mammalian species where there's clear female dominance. So the ring-tailed lemurs, for example, and of course spotted hyenas. And in those two species, it's very unlikely. It rarely to quote unquote never occurs. So male coercion on females. And I would suspect that there's some enforcement, there's some kind of based on the dominance, the power difference of that behavior. The other example, and these are anecdotal, but Catherine and I interviewed a number of elephant experts, and we've heard about, again, anecdotally, young females who were being pursued by males, and the mature female members of these groups creating a kind of protection for the females, but beyond that, I don't know. Richard Wrangham, of course, in his new book, The Goodness Paradox, does talk about enforcement, but not specifically when it comes to sexual coercion.
Okay. Great.
Thanks, Barbara. Rachel, do you have anything you want to follow up with Barbara?
No.
All right. Well, Rachel, thanks for being in here. I'm going to bring in our correspondent who deals with zombie dance and music and nonverbal communication, Jessica Phillips Silver. Jessica, thank you for being with us. I'm curious about your perspective on this as a dancer and musician. How do you see this sort of dance of consent playing out, and what are your insights from your unique perspective?
Yeah, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for bringing me in. And I have to confess, I'm not an expert in thinking about dance and music in terms of consent per se, but I do like to think about it in terms of signals towards cooperation. And I think that one question, I think, one thought I had listening to Barb a few minutes ago is that when she said that courtship should not be thought of as a dance per se, I completely got the importance of that point in terms of when we think of dance as an art that's choreographed and performed and has a predetermined outcome, as she said. But I actually like to think of music and dance more in terms of the communication system, like Barb was talking about, because there's a lot of communication that gets transferred around the idea of the timing of the movements that take place. When we're moving together in time, we're actually signaling a lot of information about synchrony, not just in terms of temporal synchrony, but also, emotional or affective synchrony.
Fascinating. So Jessica, you're saying that dance is not just about sort of a set of choreographed movements, but that there can be this sort of back and forth and communication that happens within dance. And I have to say, from my perspective as I used to be a social dance teacher in the before times, salsa and tango and all this, that really like this, idea of sort of leading and following is not as like black and white as you might think, right? It's not that like, well, the lead does this and then makes the follow do this. A really good lead is having the follow be as much a part of creating the dance as the lead is, right? Is responding to what the follow is doing and then incorporating that into making the dance really an enjoyable dance and one that can be much better actually because it has the input from both of the partners.
Yeah, and you said it right now, Athena, when you said that that's what a good lead does, and a good follow knows how to listen and then enter into the conversation and even provide a little bit of direction. So there's very much a back and forth when we have the skills to notice. But that may be kind of a key to understanding consent, right? What happens when somebody doesn't have a subtle enough perception to notice? That might be where signals get missed, right?
So can dance be a helpful tool for people to build an understanding of sort of nonverbal consent?
I think that music and dance in general are ways to build a lot of skills about understanding, what true listening is, what true cooperation is, and in particular, not necessarily in a verbal context. There's a lot of I think there's a lot about our basically embodied experience that we get to live and practice through our musical behavior that can be extremely informative. And, the other thing that's coming up for me as I think about it and listen to all of you is that there are entire cultures of music and dance that are completely founded on this ongoing real-time process of creation between either let's say the couple that's dancing or the group that's playing, or even between those that are performing and those that are receiving the performance, the audience. So there are art forms like, I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, and the music that's native to the Black culture of Washington, D.C. is go-go music. And by definition, it's an act of musical and dance creation that's made in real time as the band performs and the audience interacts. And
what is this form of music? Can you say it again?
It's called go-go music.
Okay.
And it's based in the very, very long African traditions of using music to pass down oral history and also to comment on what's happening currently in time. So it really is a lot. It's about communication in a lot of ways that would not be captured if we thought of it as merely a performance that had a predetermined outcome. It's not that at all. And that's just one example that, I happen to be studying about right now. There are many more. And I think that's actually truer to our evolutionary history of music and dance.
Barbara.
Yeah.
I love all of this. First of all, I'm typing furiously because I couldn't agree with you more about the synchronization. And as you said that, I was just thinking, wow, so many of these courtship, the stuff that I even showed, there's all of this synchronization. And I have some wonderful videos of adolescent birds trying to learn this coordination. And it's the synchronization that is sort of part of the courtship and is probably part of the arousal, which connects also to music and this sort of very ancient relationship between music and arousal. There's certain canary species that when the male actually masters these particularly sexy syllables, it induces ovulation. The song induces ovulation. And some believe that the chorus of humpback whale males, that music also is initiating ovulation. So there's this music linkage that is so powerful and ancient.
Absolutely. And I think, we observe, features of that in parent-infant interactions, right? So we talk a lot about synchronicity or synchrony, or across fields, they use different terms, but what we need to focus on is that there's a particular rhythmic timing, that leads to our brain's ability to anticipate what's coming. And when I can listen to you, even if I'm an infant who's pre-verbal and I don't understand the content of the words, I can pick up on the meaning of the timing. And when I can predict what's coming in our relationship from paying attention to my caregiver and vice versa, that strengthens our relationship.
So let's turn to this question now for both of you. Given what we know about consent in the animal world and about sort of the communication that can happen, non-verbally, what does this mean for establishing consent if you are a zombie and you're trying to mate with another zombie, or a human, you're trying to mate with a zombie, and that zombie is not a verbal zombie? I mean, we've seen, some different examples throughout the course of the last few days of zombies that sort of vary on their spectrum from being verbal to non-verbal. Barb, do you have any thoughts about that to begin?
Yeah, so I just sort of want to say that I am pretty careful to sort of tiptoe around not actually talking about consent, even though for the title it's to be provocative, but rather to sort of look at clearly coercive versus non-coercive, even though secretly I think there is some way of thinking about animal consent. But the reason that I don't is that there continues to be so much confusion, and it's such an extremely important high stakes issue right now that to define consent in the animal world without language feels at this moment in time something that is a little bit dangerous to do. So I sort of skirt around that by talking about coercive, non-coercive. But having said that, if you look at actual definitions of consent, they vary. And in my class, we have the students really look at lots of different definitions, and not all require explicit language. But I think it's at this moment in time, given how much confusion and the opportunity and the stakes, the danger, particularly as young people are learning to be sexual and have to learn sexual communication, I steer away from that term.
So if you are sort of looking to get involved in a relationship with a zombie then who is nonverbal, Barbara, would you recommend that you let the zombie initiate everything so that there's sort of no lack of clarity about consent?
Well, what I would do is make sure that when I have in the K through 12 zombie experience, that sexual education is more than learning how to put a condom on a zombie penis, that copulation is easy, courtship is hard, and I would focus more of the zombie sexual education on sexual communication. Thanks, Barbara.
Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Athena, going back to a point you made a few moments ago about, could dance be a tool that we could develop more mastery around for nonverbal communication? I would say yes. And the reason that I would say that is because dance and music, for me, that, you know, these are one category, but music and dance really enable us to develop a sense of body mastery, you know, a certain vocabulary and ability to make subtle distinctions and choose how we want to express through our nonverbal communication, as well as being able to become more masterful at interpreting nonverbal language and cues from other people. And I believe that to the extent that music and dance could be used as tools to strengthen these communicative abilities, it makes sense to use them, especially early on in development.
Dave, did you want to jump in?
No, although I do think it might be nice to bring our next commentator on in a minute, because we've been talking about sort of the sounds that induce ovulation and things like that.
Yeah, so Jessica and Barbara, I hope that you guys will stick with us in the studio, because our next talk is really about distinguishing nonverbal communication that is positive versus negative. So thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Barbara. And next up, we are going to hear from Jacob Patten about these questions of how you could distinguish zombie moans of pleasure from zombie moans of pain. So here with us to explain how you tell the difference is our very own Jacob Patten. Jake.
Hey, thank you. So
Jake, we can't hear you. Oh, there you are.
Oh, you can't. Oh, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. You're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, good. All right. So I mean, pleasure and pain sounds. I think, let's see, the first way to jump into this, I'm not going to make anybody ovulate. There's no zombie sound that's going to get us to to get anybody to ovulate. Certainly not you and me, Dave. But what I do want to focus on are, like we were talking about, these sounds of pleasure and sounds of pain, moans of pleasure and moans of pain, which ties all the way back to what we've been talking about, sex, the whole time. Grabbed some moans of pleasure and looked at the acoustic properties of those, and then looked at moans of pain. I couldn't grab any zombie participants. If you've seen the documentary Day of the Dead, you know that that's not a good thing to do. So I grabbed human participants and also found other recordings of instances of pain sounds. Okay, but before we get into that and we look at the acoustic differences between those, there's something that I want to talk to you guys about, which is think about the word information. Just say the word information. You guys in the studio, anybody watching at home, information. So the last part of it, shun. The vowel in there is an unstressed which we call the schwa. And as near as I can tell, a lot of zombie moans are these unstressed vowel sounds. So Athena and Dave, give us your best zombie moan, like a slow Romero zombie kind of moan.
Wait, I could do better.
That's good. That's exactly what
muted, Athena.
That was a good one.
That's pretty good. I mean, that's less unstressed, but that's still really good. That's great. Yeah, that's perfect. So we've got one that's kind of unstressed, like there's no muscle tone going on with Dave's, which is perfect, right? Because this is like a dead thing. We don't have much muscle tone. Athena's is like banging up right against those fast zombies. And so a lot of times what you hear with the fast zombies is more of like a like they'll go through the and more into like an like a rah kind of thing like that. We also see this in human communication with swear words. So if you guys can pop up really quickly that first image. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So a lot of our human swear word concentration is inside that little blue shape It's a circle that's got a point on it. I don't know what to call that. But so a lot of our we've got tons of words. Say, I'm not going to go too blue on this, but ass and stuff like that. You can think of a ton of words, I'm sure. There's a lot of ones in as well. What we don't see.
You can swear as much as you want to.
Oh, can I? Oh, this is great. This is fantastic. I know Carlo's watching with his children, so I'm going to do earmuffs really quickly. So, motherfucker is perfect.
They swear worse than you do, probably.
They swear worse than I do. Okay, great. Wonderful. So, motherfucker is a great example of this. So we've got a lot in we've got tons of stuff over in ass. It seems like the there's a little bit less like bad, more less offensive words in but in we've got quite
Jake,
a few.
Can I ask real quick what we're looking at here, because it's a little small? These are different phonics, basically.
Yeah, these are the different phonemes in North American speech, so Canadian and American speech. And of course, there's a little bit of differences due to accents. But this is kind of our
okay. So these are sort of different vowel sounds. Basically?
Yeah, these are different vowel sounds. Exactly. Okay. And so at the top, so what's underlined here in these words, this BT environment, this is the vowel sound that all of these symbols are representing for you. So but, which I've got there, the symbol represents the sound. It's the same point as the schwa. So Dave, your moan, and Athena, your moan, even though one was stressed and one was unstressed, they're both kind of in that space down near where a lot of our English swear words tend to be. And the fast zombies tend to be more over towards the ass side. Can you guys pop up the second graphic really quickly?
Sure.
Exactly. Okay, so I've got my Rom-zoms, my Romero zombies, that's what I'm going to call them, and then speed zeeds tend to be more over on the ass side. But this tends to be in the same area where maybe our zombie moans tend to be. But now let's talk about moans of pleasure. So when we look at the moans that I gathered from the participants, these were actually people who for some reason would still send me, sound clips, even though we're in the middle of an apocalypse, and a little bit of field research on my own getting those pleasure moans. So when we look at them both, there's a little bit of noise in both signals, but the difference in the noise is really the key. So if we look at extra noise just from breathing, it seems like the pleasure moans are very harmonic, but there's noise from breathing, which means the vocal folds aren't totally adducted all the way. They're not completely closed. There's still some air that's able to escape between those. Now that might be because when people are in the middle of some sort of pleasurable act, there's a lot of breathing going on. That makes sense. But there's a lot of harmonicity, and that's really the key. When we talk about moans of pain, which sound a lot like zombie moans, the harmonicity drops noticeably. And this isn't just from extra breath. The harmonicity actually drops. If you measure the peaks of harmonics in these sounds, they are not harmonic like typical moans, typical speech, anything like that. So what it looks like is that our sort of, I hesitate to call it nonverbal communication because we're still making sounds, but even this communication that, well, it's not verbal, it doesn't have words in it, so I guess we'll call it nonverbal sounds.
Non-linguistic, maybe?
Non-linguistic, thank you. Yes, perfect. They all kind of fall into the same general continuum as our typical speech. Now, what I should say is that when we're talking about those swear words, that graph is a perceptual graph. We generated it from people listening to different sounds and rating the similarity between the sounds. It gels almost perfectly with graphs of how they're actually made in the mouth, but not exactly. They're very close, but not quite one-to-one. If we actually looked at the specific prosody that people use, and this is something that we're going to try to research if the pandemic, if the zombies get shot. So hopefully those guys that were in Larry's house were good dudes. It didn't really look like it, but maybe they're going to help us get rid of all the zombies. If they do, what we want to see is if when we're saying different sounds, what we want to do really is take the word fuck. And we want to have people say the word fuck in a bunch of different ways. So in awe, in anger, in pain. And we want to see if
you ever
what I
lived in
showed you.
Philly, you really get to see the frame, like like there's so much diversity in the way that you can say the word fuck. In fact, fuck was one of my daughter's first words growing up in Philly.
That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. So we just need to grab a bunch of participants from Philly. And there's probably ways to use it that we haven't even thought of. We want to, we want to see if those map out. So fuck, like if you're in awe of something, is that over towards, is the way that our harmonicity works, does that push it more towards the ooh side of the graph where there were no swear words? And if you're really pissed off, fuck, like does that push it over towards the less harmonic side? So anyway, it seems like even these moans, these non-linguistic methods of communication that we have and that zombies have, fall into the same space. And this could explain why words, if we think about crap and poop, crap and poop. Let's go with crap and poop. So neither of these words, if you trace back through the etymology of both of them, neither one was considered offensive in any way. And I know neither one of those is like super offensive at all. But crap is definitely a little bit worse than poop, right? It's possible that the sounds, just purely the vowel sounds that they have in them, made them kind of fall down through the plinko of history and put crap in the more offensive side and poop in the less offensive side. And we think that this might also be true for things like fuck, which originally wasn't vulgar, ass, which of course wasn't vulgar either. So it seems like a lot of the vulgar words that we have that didn't used to be vulgar end up in that little box in the corner where all the rest of the swear words were.
Can I ask a question about crap and poop, the words? And but they are, so I think of poop as like when you're potty training your kid, right? They're almost like, it's almost like the parental. So are there sort of also, in addition to these sort of pleasure and pain sounds, are there like parental sounds?
Yeah, for sure. The exact, so if we pop up the first, either graph,
sure,
really quickly again.
Okay, first one. Here's first one.
Sure, yeah. So if you notice, if you look at the very bottom, we've got the If you look to your left, we've got the a. Now, if you go to the top, we've got e, and then to the right, we've got oo. And it actually seems like a lot of these words that we use with kids, like these parental sounds, tend to fall into the oo and the e. And actually, if you look at the sounds that animals make when they're engaging in non-linguistic communication, sonic communication, they'll make these same kind of soft sounds that might fall into the same area as oo and e when they're communicating with, say, their offspring or other things in their brood. When they go to make a display to get other animals away from them, or a hunting sound, something like that, they'll push it way over towards the a side, less harmonic. So anyway, to answer your question in less words than that, yeah, absolutely. And it seems like there's a lot of oo and e, like we throw y at the end of things, like doggy, and a lot of things have more of an oo sound when we're talking to children. So yeah, like a parentese focuses more on oo and e sorts of sounds.
So I should tell my kids, you guys should get in the fucking car now, to sort of sound a little more parental.
Yeah, it's right. More parental and more Irish also. Like, get in the fucking car. And they...
All right.
Jake, this is just tremendous to think about how these aspects of communication in terms of how we're vocalizing vowels can really transcend linguistic communications. What do you think are the implications for our communication with zombies that are non-linguistic?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, assuming they can hear sounds, which we think that they can. They seem to be drawn towards gunshots. They seem to be drawn towards screams and stuff like that. So we know that there's some sort of auditory processing intact. We might be able to establish some sort of communication with them. So maybe their linguistic centers have been knocked out, right? So maybe more of this outer left side of the brain is atrophied or destroyed by the disease, who knows? But there might be some more low-level realm of communication there. And it might be something where we can make non-threatening sounds to them. So, ooh, ooh, kinds of things. There's a fucking zombie over there. And
I mean, even zombie does sound cuter, you know? Oh, look, there's
Doesn't
a
it?
zombie. Yeah, so.
Exactly.
I mean, we've all become zombies in this day and age, haven't we? So we're talking about us. We're talking about
exactly.
zombies.
These zombies, yeah.
So
we
yeah,
could get
really
them
interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to you also kind of providing us with maybe the first guide for translation with zombie sounds to human sounds and how we could communicate with them based on this framework that you put together.
Can I ask
That's
one last
my
question?
hope.
Oh, sure. Just one last thing. Are these cross-cultural, these sort of differences between these sounds, or is this?
That is such a good question. That is a great question. And I'll tell you, the two languages that I kind of speak other than English don't have as many vowel sounds as English. I think one of the things that we think as English speakers is like our language is kind of boring. But actually, one of the things that we can have a little bit of pride in is that we have a pretty large vowel set. We're a Germanic language, but German has fewer vowel sounds than we do. And then Spanish is the other one I kind of speak, and they have a lot fewer vowel sounds as well. And that makes it hard to do this research because there's a lot less degrees of free. There's fewer degrees of freedom that I have to work with, so I can't see differences as much. However, Welsh is a wonderful language for vowel sounds. They have, I feel like 7 more vowel sounds than we do. And I'm trying to make contact with researchers in Wales or anybody who speaks Welsh to look at their vowel sounds and their swear words and see if it maps out the same way.
Interesting. So, cool.
Yeah.
We have
what the fuck do you say after that?
We had a
right?
linguist from Sweden, I think, that was on yesterday. Might be worth reaching out to.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So, so no, it's really interesting because yeah, I'd be curious to know if you know, like if this would be the same across the world. So
I would too.
Yeah.
In a way,
all right. Well.
Sorry.
So
we can't wait for the translation book. I think that's going to be a hit, especially as we're trying to figure out how we can coexist with zombies, you know, where that is a possibility, and recognizing that they are kind of on a range from being more verbal to less verbal. So thanks so much for being with us, Jake.
Cool.
So next up, we have our religion correspondent, Sam Kustenbaum, to kind of provide us another perspective here on all the topics that we have been discussing today. Sam, thank you so much for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
Sam, what are your thoughts? You know, a lot of things have come up today. You know, culture, consent and coercion, religion, and you know how this relates to human zombie relations. What do you have to share with us from that big brain of yours, kind of making sense of the goings on today?
Right. Yeah. I mean, some things I might offer would be the kind of religious kind of cultural history around ideas of kind of normative sexual behavior, consent, and right, this idea, which is kind of ushered in largely during kind of Cold War time. It's the idea of brainwashing, that is kind of losing your ability to kind of make rational decisions. But it has some older history to that as well. I mean, we see it around kind of discourse around kind of cult discourse, groups, kind of non-normative religious groups that are described as cults, the kind of pejorative quality of that. I mean, from like the 19th century or 20th century, 19th century, you know, you have all sorts of groups kind of flourishing in the time of the Second Great Awakening, like Mormons, Shakers, the Oneida community, people kind of doing non-normative sexual behaviors, right? These kind of groups providing space for things like polygamy or utter abstinence or complex marriage. So, and you have discomfort from the kind of Protestant patriarchy around these sort of behaviors. And I don't mean to be an utter kind of apologist for all sorts of any kind of spiritual experimentation happening within small groups. Far from it, but just kind of putting that in context of this kind of cultural religious history around consent and experimentation and ideas of kind of people kind of being in control or not, depending on kind of who is viewing that experimentation itself. So that's that's something to kind of add to it. I could say a bit more about like the cult kind of discourse happening around things happening today, which is also very interesting.
I would love to hear more about that. Right. I mean, so for those of us who are still watching television in the apocalypse, there's been some really interesting publicity and a documentary right around the Nexium cult, which has been called a sex cult. Are there other cults that kind of where there are these questions sort of about consent and sexuality and what's happening now in terms of this landscape?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Nexium one is an obvious one to bring in here, right? And and I think part of the reason why this one is so part of the kind of buzz around this also, I think we have to admit, is because dealing with famous people, famous white women who I think we the culture is kind of particularly invested in their sexuality in ways that has a pretty long history.
Can I just ask, the Nexium cult, is this the one, like, what is this cult?
This is Keith Raniere. I haven't covered this extensively, so my summation is not going to be as good as some colleagues who have, but this is a kind of a self-help, self-realization type of kind of tiered membership group that starts in Albany. This guy Keith Raniere is the center of it. He's known as the Vanguard, and cultivates a kind of worshipful group around him, mostly of upper-class women, some celebrities, who are well-moneyed, and the kind of most salacious details of it are that at a certain point they start getting branded tattoos of his name on their bodies. He's having sex with many of them, and there's a new HBO documentary, The Vow, out, which I have not seen, so I can't really speak too much to that. But just kind of one added thing, which just about the cult discourse in general, which I think might be useful or interesting to people, is that this is very, very much active, and outside of kind of quote unquote religious kind of spaces. I mean, the way that people talk about Trump is also there's a new book out by blanking on the name, by Steve Hassan, who is kind of a long-standing cult expert. He was a Moonie at one point, and this book is called The Cult of Trump, and it's looking at Trumpism using this kind of rubric that he is a kind of a pretty idiosyncratic, or it's his rubric of what constitutes a cult, and he's looking at Trumpism as a cult. At the same time, on the right, the discourse around what they would call the Great Awakening, the protests around George Floyd, this kind of fear of critical race studies entering into public institutions, et cetera, et cetera. This is also described as an irrational religious enthusiasm in which people are kind of losing their kind of rational thinking. So this is very much a kind of an active way of describing, denigrating at times. Most of the time denigrating people participating in a group or a movement and kind of losing themselves fully in it. So I think it's an active term, a descriptive term, a fraught term that has a lot of purchase still today.
Yeah, well, and it ties back in also with what we heard from Lee Cronk earlier about sort of culture and how, when you're embedded within a group where you're, getting certain information, that can then, have an effect on us, and kind of, thinking of, well, how is it that we're susceptible to zombification, and where do we draw that line? And then, I think this question of, when you have people very isolated, how does that change the ability for zombification? Very tied into these cult issues. So Sam, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that we'll be able to have you back in the future on Undead Lab. I think this whole, question of, cults and, in general, like religious and spiritual notions and how they intersect with zombification is a hugely important topic. So thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here and happy to help in whatever way I can. All right.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
And next, we have our zombie immunology and epidemiology correspondent, Jessica Brinkworth. Jessica, what do you see as some of the public health consequences of what we have heard about today?
Oh my God. So I had so many thoughts that I wrote a whole bunch of them down throughout the session. But the very first thing I thought about with the first talk was a paper that was published a couple of years ago out of the University of Ottawa that talked about the zombie apocalypse and epidemiological modeling. What would be the ideal tactic to take in preventing a zombie apocalypse or eliminating zombies altogether. And the conclusion of that paper was that so clearly zombies being an metaphor for many other things, was that your opportunity for eliminating zombies completely is short, and you have to take a very active, very aggressive approach. And then after that, after that window, targeted elimination and quarantine is no longer going to work, and you're going to have to come up with other management strategies. And that had me thinking for the rest of the session about what everyone was saying in the context of STI risk. So to Lee's points and to Sam's points and to others around environment, and in the context of Barbara's talk, I was going through while in the session all the info that I could find on how rank and status and centrality in social networks affects whether or not something spreads or who gets what diseases. And the info is all over the map, and it grossly differs by animal species and by environmental factors. So my, conclusions based on the session was that this was an awesome session and I was really excited to listen to it. I think that if you wanted to plumb the epidemiology and management around the risk of becoming a zombie, you're going to have to take very hyper-local approaches to attempts at elimination or control.
And it sounds like you're also calling our attention to the importance of considering these power dynamics that, were something that Barbara brought up in her talk and came up also in sort of discussions about cults and also about sort of leading and following. So, how is it that these network structures, Jessica, I know that you've done a lot of work on the, COVID pandemic, for example, but how do network structures and power differentials influence how diseases spread?
So individuals, generally findings on these sorts of topics have found that individuals who are central to a network, and that is usually associated with rank. And in the context of primate studies, which is where I happen to know the most information, higher ranked individuals, the ones who have the most, privileges overall, tend to be the most central in all of the communications between all of the other primates. And so those individuals are way more likely, and it's been found in previous assessments, they're way more likely to be carrying infectious diseases that are sexually transmitted or fecal orally transmitted, and they'll hold a higher diversity of those pathogens.
That's fascinating. But at the same time, oftentimes their health is not as compromised as those who would be.
Right. Yeah. Which, absolutely. So they're also able to acquire more resources because they are so central, or because they are so high ranked. So they don't have to face the same sorts of issues. And when we look at disease transmission in human populations, we tend to see associated effects, which is that individuals who are lower socioeconomic status, who have fewer resources, who have been, segregated, and we've talked about this throughout the conference, they have the highest STI risk, right? They're the ones that are facing the greatest disease risks.
That's fascinating. Is there anything known about the sort of, asymptomatic versus symptomatic? Do individuals who are, with higher status, more central, do they have more asymptomatic versus symptomatic? Is anything known about that?
Yeah. So for our current crisis, so I was going over some information and findings with some other people the other day, and so
you're talking about COVID now.
Yeah, COVID specifically, and it's a really funny pattern. So on campuses, like I said, a lot of this is hyper local. On campuses, for example, the pattern is starting to emerge that it's people who are in a better position tend to be the ones that are spreading. That's not, I'm saying this is not published. This is something that I was going over data with somebody else, and the findings were that people who were more upwardly mobile, who didn't have to worry about a grander series of issues, were more likely to be engaged in spreading events.
Fascinating. I thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
Joining us today. We can't wait to have you back to keep us updated about the epidemiology of all of the zombie apocalypses that we're facing at the moment. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for the morning edition of Undead Live. Tune in to Eat, Pray, Run coming up next here on Channel Z. And don't forget, protect your brains by sharing them.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.